Okay, now we're on to Thursday's lesson. In this lesson, we're going to talk about sentences which have got main clauses and subordinate clauses. But this time we're going to, the sentence is going to work like this. It's going to be main clause, then there's going to be a comma, then there's going to be a subordinate clause. Now at this point, some of you might be thinking, whoa, Mr. Smales, hang on a minute. You can't have main clause, then comma, and then a subordinate clause. Doesn't work. But I haven't finished. Just wait. So, main clause, comma, subordinate clause, and then a comma, and then main clause. No, don't like the word clause. And then full stop. So main clause, subordinate clause, then main clause. Okay. Now, sometimes people call these embedded clause sentences, and sometimes people call them drop-in clause sentences, and sometimes people call them Santa Claus. No, they don't really. That's just me being silly. So, main clause sentences, embedded clause, drop-in clause, whatever you call it. Let's have a practice. Now, just like the other kinds of sentences, with these examples, what we're doing is we're thinking of two things that we want to say. So a nice, good way to start this off is to think of two things that we want to say about a person. Okay, so let's say that a person is, let's say that a police officer. So let's say it's a police officer. Actually, so police officer, and the police officer is tall and also has dark hair. Okay. Now, obviously, one way of doing it is we could say the police officer was tall and had dark hair. Okay. Now, you could, if you were in year 2 or year 3, but because we're in year 4, we think, no, we're going to do it differently. So, one of these is going to be the main clause, and the other one is going to be the subordinate clause, or the drop-in clause, or the embedded clause. So, start off. The police officer. Okay, then the police officer had dark hair. Okay, so let's just get rid of that so that we've got a bit more space. The police officer had dark hair, and we also need to say that the police officer is tall. So what we need to do is we need to put that fact into the middle, okay, and that will be the subordinate clause. So the tall part will be the subordinate clause part of the sentence. Now, there's only one place that you can put it, okay, and that place is just there. Okay, now I'll come back to putting it there in a minute, but let's just pretend that we're not really sure, and let's just try different places. Let's say here, if we put it here. So the police, if we say the police, and then we say who was tall. So the police who was tall, officer had dark hair. Does that make sense? Of course it doesn't. What about the police officer had dark, who was tall, hair? That doesn't make sense either. The police officer who was tall had dark hair. Aha, that's it. That does make sense. So we can take our little placeholder out. So we can say the police officer was tall Now, I've slightly changed it because I want you to do a little bit more thinking. So the police officer was tall, had dark hair. That's a little bit better than some of the other things we've said, but it's still not exactly right. Let's just put the word who. The police officer, who was tall, had dark hair. And then finally, because we use commas to separate the main clause from the subordinate clause, we need a comma there, just there. And we need a comma to separate the subordinate clause from the main clause, subordinate clause here, main clause just at the top there. So now the final sentence is, the police officer, who was tall, had dark hair. Okay. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to press pause, and then I'm going to write up some new ideas. Just press pause. Okay, now for this example, the important parts of the sentence that you need to know is that, first of all, the sentence is going to talk about a teacher. The teacher can be male or female, I don't really mind. The teacher is French, actually. Bonjour, monsieur. Bonjour, madame. And finally, the teacher is very funny. He or she is very funny. So those are the three important things. Remember, you've got to have a main clause, a subordinate clause, and a main clause. Now we'll do these sentences one at a time. So in a moment, I'll ask you to press pause, and then we will see how you get on. So press pause. Okay, so we continue. So the sentence starts, the teacher. That's fairly straightforward. And we're going to say that the teacher was funny. So the teacher was very funny. But we also want to say that they are French. So therefore, we say the teacher, who was French, comma, was very funny. Okay, so there we've got the example, the teacher. So let's just make sure that we've got everything. We've got them as being a teacher, yes. Do we know that they are French? Who was French? Yes. And do we know that they are very funny? Yes. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is just remove one or two little parts, little bits, and replace them with just a line. And the line means that there's a word that should go there. So the something, who was something. So instead of saying that they're French, we're just going to say that they are something. And then at the end of the sentence, we're going to say that they are something else, followed by a full stop. And that is a bit like a writing frame for your main clause, subordinate clause, main clause sentences. So whatever we're saying, if we're describing somebody, they would probably fit in. So for example, we could say the boy who was 16 was clever. Okay. And it also works for animals. The tiger, who was stripy, was ferocious. F-E-R, ferocious. Full stop. The only thing is that instead of who, because it's a tiger, we don't write who, we write which. Okay, so it actually becomes the tiger, which was stripy, was ferocious. Now you could put which was very stripy, or which was which had a stripy coat or something like that, was extremely ferocious. So you can add extra things, but that's the basic way the sentence works. Whoops, let's go back a bit that way. Okay, now something else to show you. All these different ideas. Stripy, let's get rid of stripy, because these kind of sentences also work for what we call inanimate objects. So objects, now in front of me there's a table, and there is a phone, which I'm pointing to now, which is this thing here, and there is a whiteboard. So let's go with whiteboard. So the whiteboard which was, don't forget we use which rather than who. So the whiteboard, which was old, because it is quite old, it's very, very old actually, was red and white. Okay, now that's not the best sentence ever written, but it kind of shows you how these sentences are built up. So what I will do is I will get rid of that information there, but I will leave the basic writing frame. And what I want you to do is I want you to write about 2 or 3 different things. Okay, so you could, for example, you could write about the bicycle, or the car, or the bedroom, or the house, or the street, or the teacher, or the child, or the parent. Okay, or anything you like. But what you have to do is you have to make sure that you fill in the blanks in a sensible way. So you can't say the house, which was old, was I don't know, the house which was old was wearing a yellow jacket. Okay, because houses don't wear yellow jackets. Okay, so press pause, and I'll see you on the other side. Okay, here we go again, nearly at the end of the lesson. I hope you've written quite a few sentences of your own now, and I'll just to remind you, just to make sure if you're not really sure, let's think about in another lesson we were talking about a busy road, weren't we? So let's say the road which was busy was strangely quiet. Strangely, Q-U-I-E-T. I told you I had to say it out, and then full stop. Okay, so these kind of sentences, which don't forget are called embedded clause sentences. These are excellent ways of including 2 facts in a sentence and doing it in a very, very clever way. Okay, so now we're on to the shared writing part of the lesson, and I think I'm going to write about a forest, something like that. So let's think the forest. Now the first thing to do, I suppose, is to think about all the things that we could imagine. So the forest has got lots of trees, it could be dark, it could be wet, it could be spooky if it's at night time, there could be lots of animals, there could be lots of strange sounds. Okay, so the forest, comma, which was, let's say it's dark because then that suggests that things might be a bit scary. So the forest, which was dark, so that's the first thing we're saying. And because it's dark, we want people to be a bit scared. So the forest, which was dark, comma, was full of. Now we've used strange a few times, so I'm going to say something else. What sort of sounds? Well, there were sounds which you couldn't explain. Now another way of saying which you couldn't explain is inexplicable. Inexplicable. So the forest, which was dark, was full of inexplicable sounds. Full stop. Okay. Now, what's the big deal? Who cares? Well, there's somebody in the forest. Aha. So, who's in the forest? The children. Ah, really? At night time when it's dark. The children, comma, who were talking happily. Let's say we're talking happily. Right, comma. So the children, comma, who were talking happily, comma, well, I think they begin to get a bit scared, really. So they began, the children, comma, who were talking happily, began to get scared, began to show they were scared, or show signs. There we go. Show signs of being scared. To show signs of being scared. No, even better. Began to show signs of fear. There we go. So the children who were talking happily began to show signs of fear. Now, at this point, just if you remember, when we write a subordinate clause, we can show that it's a subordinate clause by underlining it with a dotted line like that. Now, the trick with these embedded clause sentences where you've got main, sub and main is that if you take away the sub, if you take away the subordinate clause, then you've just got main clause, main clause. These aren't two separate main clauses. These are the same one, but just split in half. So if we read the sentence and we miss out the subordinate clause, the rest of the sentence should make sense. So let's have a go. The children began to show signs of fear. So I'll read that again, but a little bit more naturally. The children began to show signs of fear. Now that is a fantastic sentence on its own. That's a simple sentence, but that works, okay? So that's a way of checking that once you've got all the commas and everything like that, it's a way of checking that things are working correctly. So the children who were talking happily began to show signs of fear. And then what we'll do is we'll think about one child in particular. So one child let's say that this child noticed something. What did he notice? So one child, let's put the commas in so that we know this is where the subordinate clause, because I haven't even thought about that yet. But let's say that one child noticed that the sounds had gone away or got quieter. Another word, a really, really good word, which means when something becomes much, much less. So it could be a sound or it could be the number of things, is diminished. Had diminished. Diminished. Okay, and diminished means to become less. So one child noticed that the sounds had diminished. Why had they diminished? Spooky. But we need to know, remember, main, sub-main type of sentence, we need to say something else about the child. So one child, now we could say one child who was wearing pink pyjamas, but that would be, well, first of all, a bit pointless, and secondly, a bit silly. Let's say that he was carrying a torch though, okay? Which is what you'd expect in a forest when it's dark. In the forest? Yes, the forest. So one child, comma, who was carrying a torch, comma, noticed that the sounds had diminished, full stop. Now, in a moment, I'll ask you to press pause. Then what I would like you to do is to spend a few minutes writing 2 or 3 or more sentences of your own. Each sentence must be an embedded clause sentence. So each sentence must go main clause, subordinate clause, main clause. Okay, press pause. Okay, boys and girls, hopefully things have gone well with that. Remember, if you want me to take a look, I can't mark your work unless you show your work to me. There are lots and lots of ways you can do this. One is by getting your parents to get onto Class Dojo, and then you can type in your work for me to have a look. Second is for you to email me an example of your work, either a photograph of it or just type it into the email itself. And thirdly is by going on to the Ask Mr. Smales, that's me, and fill in the form, and it will probably take you about 2 minutes plus the time it takes you to write your sentences. So please do that. Please do get in touch. Thank you very much. Goodbye.